In this video, we're gonna do some thumbnailing. If you don't know, a thumbnail is a tiny sketch that you use even before you start sketching out or drawing your comic. And it is a really quick way to figure out how you're going to put your composition on the page, where you're gonna put your word balloons, and it is super fast. That's the idea about thumbnails. You make them super fast. You can draw 20 of them and pick the best one. And it's a great way to make your comic in tiny form before you actually dive into the page. Welcome back to Pencils and Stories. My name is Henrike and I make and teach comics. If you want to make your own comics as well, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel for weekly videos. Today I want to show you my process. I usually don't thumbnail digitally, I thumbnail on paper, but I did some digital thumbnails. So I do want to invite you to look at my thumbnail process, and I hope it's helpful to you. So this is my stock comic page that I have in Procreate. I do love the thumbnail on paper and with post-it notes and an ink pen because it feels more natural to me. I know that a lot of people like to thumbnail digitally because you will have the ability to select things and make them bigger and smaller and stuff, but I feel like making big shapes with a pencil or a pen, it just goes just as fast for me. And it helps me keep my thumbnails really rough and make them very shapy instead of going into drawing. So a thumbnail for me on a post-it note is drawn, like I can draw a ton of them in a really short time. So whenever I make a mistake, I just draw a quick box and I will have my page layout on there and some big shapes in a matter of seconds. So for me, it works really well. But I wanted to try it out a few times, so I did some digital thumbnails on the iPad, and that's cool because now I can show you my process a little bit easier. I have my stock page. I have a stock dialogue on here as well, because this is smaller than my regular page size. So I made two pages next to each other in a thumbnail file that's actually smaller because you will have more layers and stuff in Procreate if you have a smaller file size. So, but these are the ratios actually that make sense. This balloon says this is a piece of Recollection City dialogue for a balloon for the smaller sketch file, and these are the values that I use in Procreate. And this is my own font. I created this from my handwriting. It's what I use for Recollection City. I imported it in Procreate. So let's dive in. So I have these two pages next to each other. Like, don't pay attention to the panel borders because that's also stock. This is an indication for me to see how thick my gutters are. Yeah, you can see that with a brush, I painted in the gutters. You can hold down a finger and you will be able to pull a straight line in Procreate, which is helpful. I used a brush that doesn't have any dynamics on it. I will go in with this thumbnail into Clip Studio Paint, and that is where I will put in my final panel borders, my final gutters, and also the final balloons. So these balloons are sketched. And this is a thumbnail that I already had made, and I dropped it in here. It doesn't really matter for you to show how I painted it because I'm just going to talk about it right now. Let's see if I can pull it up. Yeah, there it is, a little bit clearer. So you can see that I use mostly bigger shapes. It is because I'm only focused on composition, and composition in terms of panels, but also composition on the entire page. So I also took the balloons into account. I kind of already knew how big my dialogue would be, so it was easier for me to put the balloons in there. And what you usually want is a good flow inside the panels that actually directs the reader's eye in terms of how they should move their eyes across the page. And the balloons are a very, very big part of that. The balloons and the art need to work together in terms of having a composition. That said, balloons will always be super eye-catching. So they need to have kind of like a flow of their own. They need to be read from top to bottom, from left to right, in every single panel and on every single page. So when it comes to shapes and camera angles, ideally what you want is to have some nice variety in your panels. So when you look at the page, you don't see many repetitive shapes or shapes that look kind of samey in terms of size. I had that problem on this page. You can see, if you look at this, that a lot of my figures are basically the same size. And that can look kind of boring. So you can see later on, yes, here it is. You can see later on that I actually changed up the first panel because that, you know, very same size as the fourth panel, for example. It's almost the same height as the sign in the left bottom. So I made it a little bigger. I made that figure a little bigger, and then the middle panel, I actually just made a big zoom, like big close up, which also makes sense because the character is in their head. They are thinking about stuff, so it does make sense to have a close up there. It does mean that I have to do some balloon gymnastics, which you can see right here. Like the balloons need to be scooched over a little bit, but it still makes sense in the overall flow of the balloons on the page, so it's all fine. And then, you know, I gave her a hat and stuff, and it already looks better. So I'm more satisfied with the shapes on this page. What I did then was a little bit of procrastination, because this is about basic big shapes, and this is why this is one of the reasons I don't like the thumbnail digitally, because I will start to noodle so much faster than if I would have a tiny thumbnail and a tiny post-it note, or you know, work in big shapes with big, you know, a big brush or a big ink pen. So you don't necessarily need to add in all the details. That's for your sketch phase. So eventually I realized, like, oh, I'm putting in texture and all that kind of stuff. I don't need that. Just go on to the next page. Use that technique a little bit better. And then there were some panels that I already had pretty big in my head, like the panel with the two close-ups of the lady and the man right there. Like I already had that in my head, so I just sketched it in. And then the last row of the right page is a few panels where there's actually not much changing, and it is kind of using the same shots. It does make sense story-wise to do that sometimes, because it's kind of like in a movie, the camera is focused on a person and the camera doesn't change. They just let the person act. And that is the same here as well. It is a great technique to show subtle changes within a character, maybe their expression changes, or, you know, you can kind of see what they are thinking or what they are feeling. That's why I didn't necessarily pay much attention to really change the camera angles and stuff, because what I wanted to show was this character gets an unexpected hug, and at first she's like, what do I do? And then she leans into the hug, which is a kind of like an intimate moment that has a lot of emotion, and that's why it makes sense to have the same panels. I actually use this technique a lot. If you want some good examples of that, for example, Jim Davis is a master of this in his comic Garfield. He will use oftentimes all of his panels from one strip uses the exact same images, but subtle changes. It's just the eyes are moving, or the character is smiley in one panel and the next they aren't. And then, you know, Garfield often doesn't change at all. He's just a stoic cat listening to the stories of his owner, John. And then he has some thoughts about that, and he will have a thought balloon, but his expression doesn't change. His posture doesn't change at all. So if you want some good examples of how to use not changing much in your camera angles, you know, for maximum effect, read Garfield, because Jim Davis is a master at that. This is where I start sketching, actually. So I said this is a thumbnail video, but I did want to say some more about sketching, because the nice thing is you have your shapes. All you need to do basically is draw over these shapes. It can kind of tricky if you move things around. Always keep in mind your composition, because that is a pitfall that you can kind of, your strong foundation that you have can kind of get lost if you change too much in here. So always try to zoom out and see the bigger picture and see if your composition is still working. What is nice about the thumbnail phase too, I did it here in the sketch phase, but you can actually do that in the thumbnail phase as well. I did some shadows on the characters just because I wanted to get a feel of where the light was coming from, and that makes a lot of sense. Later when you're starting to ink and or color, it might be good to have some idea of that stuff in advance. And the nice thing about doing a thumbnail or a sketch is that you can plan out a lot of things in advance, so you don't have to think about all of that stuff when you're inking and coloring. And you can see that right here, because I will do a color sketch usually pretty soon in the process, in the thumbnail phase or in the first sketch pass, because it's super easy to get a feeling of the kind of color scheme you want without having to go into detail and filling everything in and stuff. It's still so rough, so you're kind of in this experimenting mindset. So you can see me kind of figure out some basic simple color scheme, and then how strong I want the shadows to be and everything, and then I put in a local color. That's this. Local color is what a color actually is in our brains. Like, for example, grass is green, my wall is white, I'm wearing blue, that kind of stuff. But if you just put in colors without any lighting on top of it, you get the local color, and that is what it looks like this. And I see a lot of beginner comics have color schemes like this, and it looks kind of weird and unnatural. And the reason why that is because color doesn't exist like this in real life, because there's always light coming from either the sun or coming from lamps and stuff, and light will influence your local color. It will make them blend together a little bit. It will influence them. For example, when it is a sunny day, the light that comes out of the sky is usually pretty warm, but also there's a lot of blue because the sky is blue, and that blue is bouncing around the atmosphere, which is why a lot of stuff you look at in the back on a sunny day, for example, if you have a forest or a mountain on the horizon, that usually looks a little bit bluish, and that's because the blue of the sky is bouncing around in the atmosphere. And it's the same, with any kind of, any kind of light. It's all bouncing around. For example, I have one of my walls of my room is green. And when there's a very bright, sunny light shining on that green, the green is actually starts to bounce around, and you can see that green reflect on my other wall, which is white, as green. And then on other objects in the vicinity, those will also have a green highlight on them because the color of the wall is bouncing around. So color never exists in a vacuum, and that is why when you have local color, it doesn't really make much sense to our eyes, because that's not how color works in real life. There's light that influences it. So I usually throw on a lot of, you can see it kind of here, like I would throw on some green and light blue because it is a kind of a sunny day, but I also did want some nostalgic, so I made it kind of like a nostalgic blue and greenish color, and I'm like just experimenting with adjustment layers and the hue and saturation and all of that stuff. So here I'm kind of looking at my values. The good thing about values is if that's solid and readable, then you can hardly mess up the color. There's very hard to mess up the color if you keep these values in your colors like you want them. These are not the right values yet, but it's kind of getting there. So yeah, it's a lot of experimenting with color, and this can be done pretty easily. It looks very complicated, but just to have a feel, and then eventually you can even, use your final color scheme. Like, let me see if I can find it. I thought I had it here somewhere. Yeah, these kinds of color schemes I do like. Yeah, I'm getting really close here with the colors. But then usually you can just, you can drop these colors just as your flats, and you hardly have to do any, you can use these colors in your flats, your flat color layer, and then all you have to do is put in some shading, but the colors will already look really good. So it really saves you some rendering time in the end. So that's awesome. So here I did some more fine-tuning of especially the first two panels, which were giving me a lot of grief. I do like to have very tight drawings, so in the inking phase I don't have to think about where to put my lines, and I don't have to think about anatomy. I can just focus on, well, I actually do want to still be thinking about anatomy when you're inking, but you know, I don't have to go like, ooh, what's it gonna look like? So you mainly have to think about making some really pretty line art instead of having to think of, ooh, how is this eye sitting in the eye socket? You know, you don't want to have to be thinking about that when you're inking. So I like to do some tight pencil drawings. Some more color exploration and some values for the right page, because that has very different lighting than the left page. Very strong shadows, very strong lights because we're inside. They don't have the lamps on yet, but there's some evening light coming in. So yeah, these are the final drawings on the left page. And I start drawing the right page, but the left page was the main example here. Yeah, you can go as far as you want, and then I would enlarge this page, and then do the inking and the coloring. That's the final step. You do wanna make sure to do that on the actual file size of your page. That was it for this video. I hope it was helpful. Maybe it gave you some new ideas, or it is a good reminder to not dive into all of the details in the thumbnailing process. Maybe it was the part about planning some stuff in advance that's really easy in the thumbnail or sketch phase, so that you can blast through inking and coloring faster because of the planning you did in advance. Thumbnails is one of the most important parts of the comic process. I would even argue it is the most important step, because this is where you actually make your comic page. After this is just production. If you want some more quick comic tips, I do have a PDF that you get as a reward for subscribing to my email list. If you're not on my list already, it is a great way to keep up to date to new videos, any news in the comic world, or any goodies I find on the web, or even discounts for stuff in my shop. So if you're not subscribed to my email list yet, I want to invite you to go to pencilsandstories.com/extra. You can also visit pencilsandstories.com for some more info and general resources about comic. I have a big resource list about everything comics on my website. It's free for you to watch. But yeah, all of those links are in the description below. Get my comic quick tips PDF. It is helpful if you want some new ideas to quickly improve your comic. And I will see you in the next video. This was it for this week. I want to thank you so much for watching. Give it a thumbs up, because those kinds of metrics show me what kind of stuff you like to see, what kind of videos you want from me. So give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and for now, go and make some comics.